Hi, it's Dwyer, gamblersadvisory.com, DwyerVIP.com for premium picks on Roku, Dwyer Sports Betting, and Dwyer Boxing News. Remember, the opinion you should follow should be your own. Just consider this video to be a second opinion from a complete stranger online. David Haye has withdrawn from his fight against Manuel Charr, citing a hand injury. Let me tell you, other than a detached retina or arthritis, hand injuries are as serious as it gets in boxing. If a guy has a chronic hand injury, he could easily be transformed from a puncher into a non-puncher. I know to fans like you and me, it might not seem like a big deal, but it's impossible to hide your hands in a fight. You can hide a lot of other things. Let's say you have a trick knee or something. If you're skillful up close, you might be able to pick opponents with limited mobility and dazzle us with your inside fighting and up close fighting ability. But the problem with hand injuries is if you're a technician in the ring, it takes away your game plan. You'll see right hands or right hand openings, and you won't be able to throw your right hand because it'll be too painful. Or you could get the guy in trouble and then realize that you don't have what it takes to finish the guy because your hands are too sore. I was watching Floyd Mayweather 24/7 a few years ago, and they were talking about how Floyd got shots into his hands because his hands were too painful after sparring. And I immediately, after hearing that news, understood that I needed to look long and hard at the overs in Floyd Mayweather fights, because a skillful fighter with painful hands won't finish an opponent early in fights. They'll be cautious because if they go too hard too early, their hands might fail them later in the fight. Well, let me tell you, since that Floyd Mayweather 24/7, understand that I believe Floyd has only knocked out Victor Ortiz. And that was almost during a break in the action where not only was Ortiz unprepared thinking there was a timeout, but Joe Cortez, the referee, was looking outside the ring, right? As longtime viewers know, my hedge in the Mayweather-Guerrero fight was the over. Because Floyd has had tender hands, I'm looking at overs in fights. Well, take a look at David Haye. He's one of the hardest punchers in boxing. You need to view his hand injury like you would view a serious concussion that a fighter has had in their last fight. Just like I wouldn't take Lucien Boutte after he got concussed against Carl Froch, right, in his next fight. It's the same way with David Haye. If you're thinking about laying money on Haye, my advice to you is to read up on stories concerning his hand injury. I know Haye has had health issues before. I think there was a back injury that canceled the fight. I know there was a toe injury used as an explanation for the Vladimir Klitschko performance. I understand Haye has been dinged up in the past. But as I said before, hand injuries, in my opinion, are much more serious than toe injuries, right? Very serious stuff. Big George Foreman wouldn't shake hands late in his career because his hands were too valuable to him, right? So, Foreman was notorious for waving at you. Friendly guy. Just didn't want to use his tools of the trade in handshakes with strangers. That's how serious a hand injury is, especially for someone like David Haye, who hits as hard as he does. I encourage everyone to Google the comments of another very hard hitter, one of the hardest punchers I've ever seen in my life, pound for pound. Prince Nassim Hamed, in interviews, used to talk about his hands and the problems they caused him. This David Haye injury, in my opinion, is serious. You should figure out if it's a broken bone, if it's cartilage problems, which in my opinion are more serious. Keep in mind too, sometimes fighters have scarring around their knuckles on their hands, and if that scar tissue is now rubbing up on a ligament or cartilage and stuff like that, that could be an ongoing problem. David Haye, without the power, wouldn't be David Haye. So take a hard look at that. Also, there's a great article. I've posted it on DwyerBoxingNews.com. It's actually written for ESPN. It's written by a guy named Eric Raskin, who apparently was the only voter in ESPN's poll who picked Andre Ward over Floyd Mayweather as the best fighter in boxing, pound for pound. Now, I disagree with Mr. Raskin, really based on the CompuBox numbers. Floyd really does stand alone in terms of his CompuBox dominance in fights, right? By that I mean Floyd lands a much higher percentage than his opponents. Floyd lands, power shots at really incredible rates. In terms of accuracy and in terms of defense, it's very hard to dispute Mayweather's brilliance, right? But Raskin makes some points that you need to think about, right? Now, Raskin points out that by the time most fighters make a top 10 pound for pound list, they're already in decline. In other words, the very nature of ranking fighters has us overlooking young lions who might be among the very best in boxing pound for pound. For example, he points out that when Floyd Mayweather was at his absolute best in 2001, when he destroyed Diego Corrales, he wasn't number one on many people's pound for pound lists, right? Even though that Floyd might beat every other Floyd there is, right? In fact, he points out that on many lists at the time, he wasn't number 2 or number 3 because most people were in love with Roy Jones, Shane Mosley, and Felix Trinidad at the time. But yet, if you look on the tapes, Floyd then was more mobile than Floyd is now. The hand speed was at least as fast as it is now. Basically, what happened was when people were making their lists, they didn't want to give a lot of credit to a guy who was in his mid-20s, who hadn't been around the block as long back then as had Trinidad and Shane Mosley, right? Raskin makes another point, and I think it's a very important point. He points out that we like fighters who give us oohs and ahs, that very effective fighters, like a Bernard Hopkins, are often overlooked in their prime because they don't have the flashy hand speed, the explosive punching power of, let's say, a Roy Jones Jr. Give me a moment. Well, you know what? We'll just let that phone continue to ring. Welcome to my life. Anyway, Raskin really is making great points because his point is simply that we're always going to overvalue flashier fighters whose brilliance might be more obvious but less than the subtle brilliance of an Andre Ward or a Bernard Hopkins. Ward is a lot like Hopkins. Very effective. Very effective. but he doesn't have the kind of game where you can see it from 30,000 feet away, right? In other words, he's not flashy with combinations like a Ray Leonard, right? There's a certain showmanship in the sport, and certain fighters can kind of like bring the crowd into the ring with them with their flashiness. Paulie Malignaggi, one of the best things Malignaggi does is he has a certain charisma in the ring. But that charisma might not connote more effectiveness, right? And it's possible that just like Bernard Hopkins was overlooked, even when he was one of the dominant middleweight champs in history during his prime, just like many people were placing Felix Trinidad ahead of Bernard Hopkins. By the way, it's a matter of historical record that Felix Trinidad was the favorite, heavy favorite, going into his fight against Bernard Hopkins. Trinidad was unbeaten at the time. It's possible that we may be doing the same thing right now with Andre Ward. Understand who Andre Ward is. He's unbeaten, right? Andre Ward, according to legend, has not lost a fight since he was 14 years old. Understand, he is not just a decorated professional. He's a former Olympic gold medalist. He was ranked number 1 in his age group for years as an amateur here in the United States. And understand what he has done professionally. I mentioned Carl Froch earlier. He's beaten Froch. Mikkel Kessler. He's beaten Kessler. The best in the weight class above him at the time, according to the experts, Chad Dawson. He beat Chad Dawson. He's beaten Saki Obika. Andre Ward, quite frankly, is cleaning out the entire area code around his weight, and he's not yet 30 years old, right? His fights are such that he's fighting Carl Froch, and by the 7th round, he had a sizable lead on Froch. We all understood that he was literally lapping Carl Froch. Same could be said for his fight against Arthur Abraham, right? The Alan Green fight isn't even worth mentioning. You know, a guy is great when we get excited about fights involving 2 guys he's already beaten, which is the case right now. So while I disagree with Eric Raskin, I do love his piece. I do believe there's a structural bias in boxing. I do think that we need to just look at talent, what the guy is doing, instead of age. And I do think we need to realize that sometimes by the time these guys get, highly regarded, they've already peaked, right? Let me just point out, one of the absolute best fighters I've ever seen was Salvador Sanchez. And Salvador Sanchez died in his early 20s. At the time of his death, I don't believe Sanchez was viewed as the number 1 or number 2 fighter in the world pound for pound. But yet, in my opinion, he was an all-time great, right? And so, keep that in mind as you look at all-time great lists. Anyway, let me know what boxing story is on your mind. These are the ones that were on mine this morning on May the 14th, 2013. Thanks for stopping by.